So let me ask you something. You have been watching GPU prices for the last few months, waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger on a Radeon RX 9000 card. Maybe you have been eyeing the RX 9070 XT. Maybe the RX 9060 XT fits your budget better. Either way, you have been patient, you have been smart, and you have been waiting for prices to settle down before spending your money. I respect that. But I have to be honest with you right now because what is coming in July 2026 is going to make that waiting strategy much more painful than you expected. AMD's Radeon RX 9000 series is reportedly heading into another price increase, this time between 10 and 15%, and it is expected to hit as early as July 2026. That is not a rumor somebody pulled out of thin air. That is coming directly from Board Channels, which is a Chinese supply chain trade forum that has correctly predicted AMD pricing moves multiple times before this one. Video Cards picked it up, Tweaktown covered it, multiple hardware outlets have since confirmed that the underlying cost pressure making this happen is absolutely real, even if AMD has not officially announced anything yet. And here's the thing that really matters, the thing that most coverage is glossing over. This is not the first time this has happened. This is not even the second time. AMD has been raising prices on the RX 9000 series repeatedly since late 2025. And the reason behind every single one of those increases is the same story, just getting worse each time. Understanding that story is what will actually help you make a smart buying decision right now. So that is what this video is going to do. We are going to break down exactly what is happening, exactly why it is happening, what it means for every card in the RX 9000 lineup in real dollar terms, why NVIDIA is not doing the same thing right now and what that actually means for you. And then we are going to give you a clear, honest answer about what to do with your money before July hits. Let us start at the beginning because the price increase story did not start this month. Back in late 2025, AMD quietly raised the prices of its Radeon RX 9000 series cards for the first time. That first increase was $10 per 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So if you were looking at a 16 gigabyte card, that was a $20 increase passed straight down from AMD to its AIB partners, and then straight down from those partners to you at retail. Tom's Hardware confirmed that increase directly with an anonymous industry source inside distribution. It was not a huge number on its own. $20 more on a $599 card is uncomfortable, but not a crisis. But the same report made clear that it was being called the first wave, and that a second increase was already scheduled for January 2026. That second increase came exactly as predicted. AMD followed through. The RX 9070 XT, which launched at $599 MSRP, saw its reference price climb. The RX 9070 at $549 went the same direction. The RX 9060 XT 16GB version moved from $349 toward $369, and the 8GB version moved from $299 toward $300. None of those numbers are catastrophic individually, but stack them on top of each other and you start to see a GPU lineup that is drifting steadily away from the value position AMD originally promised when it launched the RX 9000 series. Now we are looking at a third increase, a 10 to 15% jump on top of a lineup that has already been raised twice. And the reason has not changed at all. It is the same root cause it has been since the beginning, which is GDDR6 memory. And to really understand why that memory price going up is dragging GPU prices with it, you need to understand how a graphics card is actually built and priced from the factory level all the way to what you pay at checkout. When AMD designs a new GPU, it creates two main components. The first is the GPU die itself, which is the actual chip that does the rendering, the shader work, the ray tracing, all the actual computing your games need. The second is the VRAM, the video memory that sits alongside the die and stores textures, frame buffers, and all the data the GPU needs to access instantly while it is running. AMD does not ship these two things separately to the companies that make your retail graphics cards. It ships them together as a bundle, what the industry calls a GPU plus VRAM kit. So Asus, MSI, Gigabyte, Sapphire, PowerColor, all the brands you actually see at retail, they receive these kits from AMD and then design and build the final retail card around them, adding their own cooling solution, their own PCB design, their own power delivery components. When AMD raises the price of the kit it ships to those partners, the partners have no real choice but to pass that increase through to the retail price. There is no margin fat enough to absorb a 10 to 15% memory cost increase on components that already represent the majority of the card's bill of materials. So it comes straight to you. Now let us talk about why GDDR6 is getting so expensive, because this is the core of the story and most coverage just says memory prices went up without explaining the actual mechanism. GDDR6 is the type of memory used in consumer graphics cards, including every card in the RX 9000 series. It is not the exotic high bandwidth memory that you hear about in AI accelerators. It is the more mainstream memory that goes into the GPUs that gamers actually buy. And its spot price, meaning the market rate for buying it immediately, rather than on a long-term contract, has tripled since late 2025. We are talking about prices moving from roughly $2, $50 per gigabyte up to around $7. 50 per gigabyte, according to Silicon Motion analyst Wallace Cow, as reported by Tech4Gamers. That is not a small fluctuation. That is a structural shift in the cost of making a graphics card. Why did this happen? The reason is not complicated, but it does require understanding how memory manufacturing actually works. Companies like Samsung and SK Hynix make memory. They have a finite amount of manufacturing capacity at any given time. You cannot simply add a new memory fab overnight. These facilities cost billions of dollars and take years to build. The capacity that exists right now is essentially fixed for the foreseeable future. The AI boom over the last couple of years created an absolutely enormous demand for a specific type of memory called HBM, which stands for high bandwidth memory. HBM is what goes into the data center AI accelerators that every major tech company on the planet is buying in massive quantities right now. The AI infrastructure build-out from companies like Google, Microsoft, Meta, and Amazon is consuming memory at a scale that the industry genuinely was not prepared for. AI is expected to account for 20% of total DRAM production in 2026. That is an enormous allocation of a resource that everybody else is also trying to buy. HBM is not the same thing as GDDR6, but here is the critical part that most people miss. Making HBM and making GDDR6 both require the same underlying manufacturing infrastructure, the same wafer fabrication equipment, and the same packaging processes, the same engineering teams. So when Samsung and SK Hynix shift their capacity toward HBM because AI customers are paying premium prices and buying in enormous volumes, that capacity comes directly from somewhere. And that somewhere is GDDR6. Less GDDR6 supply. Same or higher consumer demand for gaming GPUs. Price goes up. It is that simple and that unavoidable given current infrastructure. The memory contracts that AMD had in place with suppliers through most of 2285 helped buffer some of this. When you have a long-term supply contract, you are locked into pricing from when that contract was negotiated, which insulates you from spot market swings. But by late 2025, many of those contracts came up for renewal. When AMD and its partners went back to negotiate new supply agreements, they were no longer dealing with the old pricing. They were dealing with a spot market that had already moved dramatically upward. That renegotiation is what triggered the first round of consumer price increases in late 2025, and the subsequent rounds have reflected continued movement in memory costs since then. The problem is not going away quickly. Silicon Motion has projected that GDDR6 prices will keep rising through the second half of 2026. For the supply situation to meaningfully correct, you either need AI infrastructure spending to slow down, which nothing in the current market suggests is happening, or you need memory manufacturers to bring new fabrication capacity online, which is a process that takes 12 to 18 months at minimum, even when everyone is moving as fast as possible. Micron has warned that the shortage conditions could persist until at least late 2027, or even into 2028. Neither of those things is happening before July. Neither of those things is happening before the end of this year. This is a slow-moving structural problem, and we are sitting right in the middle of its worst phase. Now, let us talk about what a 10 to 15% increase actually looks like in real money on each card in the RX 9000 lineup, because this is where things get very concrete for people who are actually shopping right now. The RX 9060 XT 8GB version has been selling around $299 to $309 at retail after the previous increases. A 10% increase puts that at roughly $320 to $340. A 15% increase takes it up toward $345 to $355. For a card that was originally positioned as a $299 entry point into the RDNA 4 architecture, that is a meaningful shift. You're now looking at $50 to $55 more than where this card started, and for budget buyers, that gap matters enormously. The psychology of a sub-$300 GPU versus a $340 to $355 GPU is completely different for a significant portion of the market, even if the performance is identical. The RX 9060 XT 16GB version, which has been the more popular configuration because 16GB of VRAM is genuinely useful for modern games at 1440p and above, has been sitting around $340 to $369 after previous increases. 10% on that puts you at $384 to $406. 15% takes it to $402 to $424. A card that was supposed to be a strong $349 value play is now pushing up toward the $400 to $425 range, which is a very different conversation for value-oriented buyers who were counting on that specific price point. The RX 9270 at the mid-range level has been selling around $550 to $580, depending on the partner and the configuration. 10% on 5 to 65s puts you at $621, 15% takes it to $650. You're now looking at a card that was supposed to cost $549, potentially landing close to $650 at retail after all the increases stack up. At $650, the competitive comparisons with NVIDIA options shift considerably from where they were 6 months ago. The RX 9070 XT, which is the card most enthusiasts have been focused on because it delivers genuinely strong 1440p and solid 4K performance for the price, launched at $599 MSRP and has been selling for more than that through the earlier price increases. Adding another 10 to 15% on whatever its current retail price is at the time of the July increase could push it toward the $700 to $720 range, or beyond at some retailers. That is NVIDIA RTX 5070 territory, and suddenly the value math looks very different than it did when AMD was clearly winning on price to performance at launch. The RX 9080, which AMD has not yet widely launched as of this recording, but which is expected to be the high-end card rounding out the RDNA 4 consumer lineup, would also be caught by any across-the-board pricing adjustment. The board channel's report specifically references GPU and VRAM bundle pricing for the RX 9060 XT, 9070, 9070 XT, and 9080 as the primary affected SKUs. It is also worth noting that the board channel's report describes what AMD is telling its AIB partners. These are the companies that actually design and manufacture the retail cards consumers buy. AMD tells them what the GPU die plus VRAM kit costs, and the AIB partners then build their own pricing on top of that. Which means two things. First, the 10 to 15% is the floor for the increase, not the ceiling. AIB partners can, and sometimes do, add their own margin on top of AMD's increases, which means some retail cards from some brands could end up higher than the 10 to 15% baseline figure from the supply chain report. Second, not every retailer and not every model will move on exactly the same day. You may see some cards increase immediately in July, while others lag a few weeks depending on existing inventory. Retailers who bought stock at the old pricing have some flexibility. Retailers who are ordering fresh stock after the kit pricing changes have no such buffer. Now let us address the comparison that is on everyone's mind, which is NVIDIA. As of this week, NVIDIA has not issued any corresponding price increase notice to its AIB partners for the RTX 50 series. Board channels specifically noted this asymmetry, and it has been picked up across all the major hardware outlets covering this story. On the surface, that sounds like good news for NVIDIA buyers, and in a narrow short-term sense, it absolutely is. If AMD raises prices and NVIDIA holds steady, AMD's value proposition gets weaker for anyone who was already on the fence between RDNA 4 and Blackwell at similar performance and price points. But there are a few important things worth putting next to that framing before you let it change your buying decision entirely. First, NVIDIA already raised RTX 5090 AIB pricing back in May 2026. Team Green is not operating in some alternate universe where memory costs do not exist. They have already absorbed one increase and have either chosen not to pass subsequent increases on yet, are absorbing the cost from margins somewhere in the chain, or are operating under different memory supply arrangements that give them more pricing stability right now. Which of those three things is actually happening is not clear from publicly available information, and NVIDIA is not going to tell you. Second, NVIDIA uses GDDR7 in its RTX 50 series cards rather than GDDR6. GDDR7 is a newer and inherently more expensive memory standard to begin with. This means NVIDIA's exposure to the GDDR6 spot price surge that AMD is directly dealing with is different in structure. It also means that when NVIDIA does face memory cost pressure, the magnitude and timing of that pressure may be different from what AMD is experiencing right now. Third, the absence of a current NVIDIA price increase notice does not mean there will not be one by July or in the months following. Industry analysts have consistently said that if GDDR6 and GDDR7 cost pressure continues through H2 2026, which is the current expectation from every research firm that covers the memory market, NVIDIA will eventually face the same structural reality AMD is dealing with right now. The memory market is not divided into companies that pay AI-driven spot prices and companies that do not. Everyone buys from the same increasingly stressed supply chain. The timing may differ, the direction does not. The competitive implication of this NVIDIA versus AMD pricing divergence is real, though, and worth naming directly. AMD's Radeon cards have historically competed heavily on price to performance rather than raw performance superiority, because NVIDIA's RTX architecture with DLSS and its broader software ecosystem is genuinely very strong. AMD wins buyers primarily by being a better value for the performance delivered. When that price advantage gets compressed by a 10 to 15% increase, the cards that made the most sense for budget and mid-range buyers start looking less obviously correct. A buyer who was going to choose an RX 9070 XT over an RTX 5070 at similar prices because the AMD card was slightly cheaper might recalculate entirely. If the AMD card is now $50 to $80 more expensive than it was when they last compared the two, AMD's VP David McAfee was asked about further price increases at CES 2026 and reportedly would not rule them out. That is not a confirmation, but it is also not a denial. And in context with everything else happening in the memory market, it reads as someone who knows the pressure is real and is not willing to make promises the supply chain cannot keep. Let us talk about the broader context, because the GPU price situation does not exist in isolation, and understanding where it fits in the larger picture matters for making a decision that will hold up over the next year. The past 12 months have seen RAM prices increase significantly, SSD prices increase, GPU prices increase multiple times. This has created a situation where building a new PC or upgrading an existing one is simply more expensive than it was 18 months ago, across nearly every component that matters for gaming performance. Multiple industry analysts have projected that this component price pressure continues through 2026 and well into 2027. The AI infrastructure build-out that is consuming manufacturing capacity is not slowing down. Hyperscalers like Google, Microsoft, and Amazon are still expanding their data center investments. The economics of reallocating memory manufacturing capacity back toward consumer components do not make sense for manufacturers as long as HBM margins stay elevated and AI customer demand stays strong. One main gear executive summed it up clearly when he said the company had been holding off passing. DRAM price increases to customers for as long as possible, but that it could not absorb them indefinitely. What this means practically is that the GPU price problem is not something that is going to resolve itself in one product cycle or one quarter. If you're planning a PC build or a GPU upgrade and you're hoping to time the market for correction back to pre-2025 prices, that window is not coming in the near term. The smarter question is not when will prices go back down, but what is the best value I can get right now before they go up again? And how do I make sure I'm not paying for a price increase that happens 2 weeks after I pull the trigger? There is also supply availability dimension here that goes beyond just price. Memory shortages have not just made cards more expensive, they have in some cases made certain configurations harder to find at all. Japanese retailer reports have noted restrictions on high VRAM GPU purchases because of supply constraints. When demand runs ahead of supply, retailers sometimes limit how many units a single buyer can purchase, and restocks can be unpredictable. A card that is in stock today at a known price is in some ways more valuable than a card that might theoretically be cheaper in a future that has become genuinely hard to predict. So what do you actually do with all of this information? Let us be specific and direct, because that is what this channel is for. If you already have an RX 9000 series card in your cart, or you have been seriously tracking prices on one, the window before the July increase is real and worth acting on. A 10 to 15% increase on a $500 card is $50 to $75 in real money. On a $600 card, it is $60 to $90. That is not a trivial number. That is money that could have gone toward a game, a better CPU cooler, an extra storage drive. If the card you want is in stock at current pricing and the performance meets your needs, waiting specifically to get a better deal becomes very hard to justify when the next confirmed event on the horizon is a price increase and not a price drop. If you're on the fence between AMD and NVIDIA right now, the honest answer is that this price increase makes the calculus more complicated for AMD at the precise moment when AMD needs pricing clarity to win buyers who might otherwise default to NVIDIA. NVIDIA's short-term pricing stability, even if it does not last forever, creates a comparison window where Radeon cards look less clearly priced for value than they did 6 months ago. Keep watching both sides. Do not assume NVIDIA prices will hold forever, because the same memory market pressure will eventually apply. But right now, in the weeks before July, the comparison tilts slightly more toward evaluating whether an RTX 50 series option at current pricing makes more sense for your specific use case than it might have 3 months ago. If you are buying purely on a budget and the RX 9060 XT was your target because you needed to stay under a specific dollar amount, pay close attention to current inventory pricing at your preferred retailers in the next few weeks. Some retailers will move prices in sync with the supply chain shift the moment it happens. Others will discount existing inventory to clear it before the new pricing kicks in. There's a real possibility of finding a specific card at a specific retailer at a price that will simply not exist by August. That kind of opportunistic buying is worth the effort of checking multiple retailers right now rather than waiting. Price tracking tools and retailer alert services are your friends in this environment, specifically because price movements are not going to be announced in advance. If you're not planning to buy until later in the year or into 2027, the strategic picture looks like this. AMD will likely stabilize at whatever new pricing level July brings until memory market conditions change meaningfully. NVIDIA will likely face its own version of the same pressure at some point. New GPU releases from both companies will keep appearing, and competition between Radeon 5 and whatever NVIDIA has in the pipeline after Blackwell will eventually create some downward pricing pressure as new architectures push old ones out of the market. But none of that competition arrives in a time frame that helps someone who wants a card in the next 3 to 6 months, and waiting for it means accepting whatever the market does in the meantime. One more thing worth saying clearly before we wrap up, because nuance genuinely matters in a story like this. The board channel's report, while coming from a source with a documented track record of accuracy on AMD pricing, is still a supply chain trade forum post and not an official announcement from AMD. AMD has not publicly confirmed the July increase in any statement as of this recording. There's a non-zero chance the increase gets delayed, softened, or applies unevenly across different cards and regions. Retailers in some markets may see it earlier, others may see it later, or in smaller increments depending on their specific supply arrangements. What we know for certain is that the cost pressure driving the reported increase is absolutely real and documented by multiple independent sources. That AMD has already raised prices twice in the last 6 months, following exactly this kind of supply chain signal. That every analyst watching the GDDR6 market expects conditions to get worse rather than better through the end of 2026. And that the source making this call has a specific, documented track record of getting AMD pricing predictions right before the official announcements come. The probability distribution here is strongly skewed toward the increase happening rather than not. Treating it as a genuine planning assumption rather than a maybe is the rational response to that evidence. The pattern AMD has followed since late 2025 has been completely consistent. Supply chain sources flag incoming cost pressure. Board channels or a comparable forum picks it up. Hardware media covers it. AMD confirms through action within a few weeks. There is no strong reason to expect this third cycle to break that established pattern. So the bottom line is this. The Radeon RX 9000 series is a genuinely capable GPU lineup. The RDNA 4 architecture delivers real performance, particularly in the RX 9070 and RX 9070 XT segment, where AMD has been most competitive with NVIDIA on the performance per dollar metric that matters to most buyers. The repeated price increases are not AMD being greedy in some simple sense. They are AMD passing through real upstream cost pressure from a memory market that has been structurally distorted by AI infrastructure demand that no one inside AMD controls. That does not make the increases easier to absorb as a consumer, but it does mean the solution is not waiting for AMD to make a different decision. AMD cannot make a different decision when the cost of its input materials keeps rising. The solution is making your own buying decision before the market makes it for you. If a Radeon RX 9000 card belongs in your build based on your use case, resolution target, performance needs, and budget, the best version of that decision is one you make before July. After July, you are paying more for the same hardware with no improvement in the card itself, purely because the cost of the memory inside it went up in a market that has nothing to do with gaming performance or value for consumers. Watch prices at your preferred retailers over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Act on real inventory at real current prices rather than waiting for a theoretical future correction that the data says is not coming anytime soon. Do not let the perfect timing be the enemy of a good deal that exists right now. That is the situation as it actually stands heading into July 2026. If this video helped you think through your decision, drop a comment letting people know whether you are buying now or waiting and what card you are looking at. Because the more real-world data points people share in the comments, the better picture everyone gets of what is actually happening at retail level across different regions and different retailers. The official supply chain numbers tell one story. What people are actually seeing at checkout tells another. That gap is always worth tracking, and your experience is part of that picture.